Okay, so now we're actually going to get into the different types of skeletal muscles. But before we get into the actual muscles, we're going to talk a little bit about some terminology. I know all of your favorite topic there. And this second recording will include the axial muscles. These arise on the axial skeleton. About 60% of skeletal muscles are found in this category, and their job is to position the head and spinal cord and move the rib cage. The third and final recording will get into the appendicular muscles, which will stabilize or move the appendicular skeleton. So here we have the major skeletal muscles looking at the anterior view. These are the muscles that you should be able to identify and know their functions with, okay? These are what we also refer to as the superficial muscles. Here's a posterior view, okay? And on the posterior view, you will see this is also the muscles that you should be aware of. Don't panic. Some of these names are also seen on the anterior view, okay? So let's go over some definitions. The origin is a term that's used to describe the end of the muscle that stays stationary. Insertion is the end of the muscle that moves when the muscle contracts, and action is what happens when the muscle contracts. That could be flexion, extension, adduction, abduction. We saw a lot of these terms in the joints chapter. So the description of actions are described as relative to the bone that's moved. For example, flexion of the forearm, or it's also described as a joint that's involved, such as flexion at the elbow. Some other terminologies, prime mover or agonist. This is the muscle that is chiefly responsible for producing a movement. This is your primary mover. An antagonist is a muscle that opposes a movement by another muscle. It's a functional opposite to the agonist. And one rule of thumb with skeletal muscles is that typically what one muscle does, another muscle has to undo. So you will most likely have some type of antagonist against it. Muscles only pull, they do not push. A synergist, this is a muscle that helps the prime mover work efficiently. Fixators are synergists that stabilize the origin of the prime mover. Flexion at the elbow. The biceps brachii is the prime mover in flexion of the elbow. The triceps brachii is actually an antagonist, so it will do the opposite action. It will actually extend at the elbow. The brachialis is a synergist in flexion at the elbow, so because it's a synergist, the brachialis is assisting the biceps brachii. These are just some examples of how these muscles will work. Now, the basis for naming of skeletal muscles, the names of muscles often give clues to identification, such as the orientation of the muscle fibers, structural features, origin insertions, and primary function. And here are some different muscle terminologies. These are some names that you might see. Terms indicating specific body region, so they're actually describing a particular body region. Terms indicating position, direction, or fascicle arrangements. Terms indicating structural characteristics, such as how many origins they might have, such as biceps, triceps, quadriceps. And then also terms indicating their action. This is a big one. Abductors, adductors, depressors, extensors, flexors. These will all be part of the names of some of these muscles. And again, you can see this is just a continuation of that table. Technically, these two tables are right on top of each other. So they're the same categories going across the top there. Okay, so let's look at the axial muscles. These are going to involve the muscles of the head and neck, muscles of the spine, trunk, and pelvic floor. So the muscles of the head and neck are going to originate on the surface of the skull. They will insert into the dermis of the skin, and contraction will cause movement of the skin. Muscles associated with the mouth are the orbicularis oris. This constricts the opening of the mouth. The buccinator compresses the cheeks, such as when you're blowing forcefully or sort of forming, puckered lips. The temporalis and the pterygoids will assist the masseter in chewing. So the masseter is the prime mover in chewing. The temporalis and pterygoids will assist in chewing. So the muscles that are actually listed here in the text are the ones that you should know for quiz and test purposes. Now looking at the epicranium, or scalp, contains a two-part muscle that is referred to as the occipitalo-frontalis. And the anterior portion of this muscle is the frontalis muscle. The posterior is the occipitalis muscle. And the two are actually connected by a connective tissue sheath referred to as the epicranial aponeurosis. The platysma, this covers the ventral neck, and it extends from the base of the neck to the mandible. So here we can look at some of these muscles. Here we can see the temporalis. The occipitalis is back here. The frontalis is up here. We talked about the orbicularis oris, the masseter right here, which is the primary muscle involved in chewing. But then we also have our temporalis right here, and the pterygoids are right here. They are deep to the temporalis and masseter. So the temporalis and masseter lay on top of the pterygoid muscles. And again, these are all involved in chewing. I wouldn't necessarily be too much concerned with being able to identify these things, more so knowing what their functions are. So muscles of the head, muscles of the neck, this will control the position of the larynx, depress the mandible, tense the floor of the mouth, and provide a stable foundation for muscles of the tongue and pharynx. These include the digastric, your hyoids, the sternocleidomastoid muscle. And you can see these are all located there in the neck. Again, don't be too concerned with the actual locations. Looking at some of these other ones, the buccinator. The buccinator is going to compress the cheeks. The orbicularis oris will compress and purses the lips. The depressor anguli oris, this depresses the corner of the mouth. And the zygomaticus will draw the corner of the mouth back and up, such as your smiling muscles. The orbicularis oculi, this will close the eye. The frontalis raises the eyebrows, wrinkles the forehead. The occipitalis, remember that's the second half, back end of that muscle, tenses and retracts the scalp. The masseter will elevate the mandible. The temporalis and pterygoids will also elevate the mandible. The pterygoids will protract and move the mandible to either side. Again, all these muscles, the masseter, temporalis, and the pterygoids, which are part of the lower jaw, are involved in chewing. The platysma, this tenses the skin of the neck, it depresses the mandible. This one's really seen, like, for example, if you notice how men, when they shave their neck, how they tense that part up, that's the platysma. The digastric, this depresses the mandible and or elevates the larynx. And then your hyoids, these are actually going to depress the hyoid bone and the larynx. And we typically just refer to them collectively as the hyoids. And then finally, the sternocleidomastoid. This is if both sides together flex, that will flex the neck. If one side alone, this will bend the head towards that shoulder. So if the right side contracts, you'll move your head towards the right shoulder. If the left side contracts, you'll move your head towards the left side. Okay, so muscles of the spine, splenius capitis and semispinalis capitis. These work together to either extend the head or tilt the head. The erecta spinae or spinae extensors, these maintain an erect spine, such as sitting straight up. They are subdivided into the spinalis, longissimus, and iliocostalis. And then finally, the quadratus lumborum. This will flex the spinal column, and it will also depress the ribs. And here we can see all the spinal muscles there. They pretty much go straight up and down the vertebral column there. The most important one here is the erecta spina muscle, which is composed of the iliocostalis, longissimus, and spinalis. Again, these are very important in maintaining posture, maintaining, an erect spine. So let's look at the muscles of the spine. The splenius capitis, the two sides act together to extend the neck. either alone, rotates and laterally flexes the head to that side. The semispinalis capitis, the two sides act together to extend the neck. Either alone, laterally flexes the head to that side. And then finally, the spinalis group, the two sides act together to extend the vertebral column. Either side alone extends the neck and laterally flexes the head or rotates the vertebral column to that particular side. The longissimus group, if the two sides act together to extend the vertebral column, so you notice a lot of these are very similar. If they work alone, they will flex the head or vertebral column to that side. So very similar functions here. So that's why we tend to group these things together. And then finally, the iliocostalis group, this will extend the vertebral column and moves laterally to that side. Your spinal flexors, this is the quadratus lumborum. Together they press the ribs. They will flex the vertebral column. One side acting alone produces a lateral flexion. So the axial muscles of the trunk, we have the external and internal intercostals. These will elevate the ribs, and the externals will elevate the ribs. The internals will depress the ribs. These are involved in breathing. The internal and external intercostals act as accessory muscles, so they're not required for breathing, but they really help with breathing. The diaphragm, this will separate the thoracic and abdominal cavities. This is your primary breathing muscle. If this one doesn't work, you do not breathe. You then have the external and internal obliques and transverse abdominis. These will compress the abdomen, and they can also help to flex the spine. And the rectus abdominis will depress the ribs and flex the spine. And here you can see these muscles. And let's look at these guys again. The external intercostals will elevate the ribs. Internal intercostals will depress the ribs. The diaphragm, contraction expands the thoracic cavity, compressing the abdominal pelvic cavity. We'll see these three sets of muscles here again when we get to the respiratory system. The external oblique and the internal oblique are going to compress the abdomen, depress the ribs, flex and laterally flex the vertebral column. So they do the same thing, except one layer is external, one layer is internal. The transverse abdominis will compress the abdomen, and the rectus abdominis will depress the ribs and flex the vertebral column. Okay. And the final quadrant of this recording is going to be the muscles of the pelvic floor. The pelvic cavity floor is called the perineum. It's formed by a broad sheet of muscles that will connect the sacrum and the coccyx to the ischium and pubis. It helps to support the organs of the pelvic cavity. It will flex the coccyx and control movement of the material through the anal and urethra. And here we can see the muscles of the pelvic floor. So this is what we mean by forming the pelvic floor, is all these muscles essentially forming that floor that a lot of these organs are sitting on top of. And this is a male. So here we're looking at the bulbospongiosus muscle in males. Will compress the base and stiffens the penis. It'll eject urine or semen. In females, the bulbospongiosus will compress and stiffens the clitoris, and it narrows the vaginal opening. The ischiocavernosus muscle compresses and stiffens the penis and or clitoris, and the transverse perineal stabilizes the central tendon of the perineum. The external urethral sphincter in males, this closes the urethra, compresses the prostate and bulbal urethral glands. The external urethral sphincter in females closes the urethra, compresses the vaginal and greater vestibular glands. The external anal sphincter closes the anal opening, and the levator ani tenses the floor of the pelvis, supporting the pelvic organs. It flexes the coccyx, and it also helps to elevate and retract the anus. And that is the end of recording number 2.